This episode of Job Shadowing HE is kindly sponsored by Gayton B. Sanderson, the UK's leadership expert across public services, not-for-profit and education. Partnering with universities to navigate change and build stronger, more inclusive leadership teams, Gayton B. Sanderson has deep expertise in executive search, interim leadership and leadership development. Through executive search and interim leadership services, they identify and place HE leaders who reflect the communities they serve and who can drive success as the higher education landscape evolves. Through leadership development and talent consultancy services, they work closely with you to develop leaders who can deliver lasting impacts in inclusivity, collaboration and performance. Whether you're looking for your next Vice-Chancellor or seeking to recruit and develop your senior leaders, choose the experts who are known for delivering diverse shortlists, long-lasting leadership interventions and world-class client and candidate service. I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Dr. Monika Nangia, Academic Registrar and Director of Student and Academic Services at Durham University, who is leading a sector-wide project called The Power of Storytelling. Despite efforts to improve diversity and inclusion, there remains a persistent lack of ethnic diversity in senior leadership roles across professional services in UK higher education institutions. The Power of Storytelling project is gathering colleagues' stories to share their lived experiences and to help inform change across the sector. In this episode, Monika shares more about the project, as well as themes from the stories she's gathered so far. Please note that the stories may be challenging to hear, but are necessary to convey to help inform change in our sector. Monika, welcome to Job Shadowing HE and thanks for being my guest on this episode. You're Academic Registrar and Director of Student and Academic Services at Durham University, and alongside that, you're leading a sector-wide project on diversity and leadership in senior higher education professional services roles. Before we move to talk about the project, which will be the main focus of our conversation today, can you tell us a bit more about your own higher education background?
Yes, of course. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here, Susanna. A little bit about myself. Well, I grew up in India, and I did my first and second degree, so my bachelor's and master's in India. And I arrived in the UK back in 1999 as an international student. So in today's terms, when we look at what our international student community is facing and the challenges of being here, I can immediately align with those, and it reminds me of my time as a student. But my career started as a primary school teacher prior to arriving in this country, and I absolutely loved my first job, as I call it, my first love. So that's a little bit about me, my background. After completing my PhD here in the UK at Goldsmiths College, I entered the brave world of professional services in higher education. So my first job was at Queen Mary in London. It was a fascinating experience, a huge learning experience for me. I didn't realize back then that the seeds were being sown in what I was going to do 20 years later. The experiences I had during that time, which we now call perhaps microaggression, were part of our everyday lives, I guess. And looking back, I realize now how those formative years shaped my worldview of higher education as it currently is.
And within that career journey you've just talked about then, you've mentioned there a bit about microaggressions and your experience of that. Can you say a bit more about your personal experience of the lack of ethnic diversity in HE professional services and the implications there have been of that on you and on your career path so far?
I was quite fortunate when I came to this country in terms of having a good role model. That's one of the things that I find, even till date, some of the junior colleagues in professional services find lacking, lack of role models from ethnic minority backgrounds in senior leadership positions. So my PhD supervisor was Indian and hugely inspirational. She was a trailblazer in her time, and I saw her progress from a lecturer to a deputy vice chancellor within a space of just 5 years. That's how trailblazing she was. And that really inspired me. I thought, if she can do it, you know, sky is the limit for us. Although she had followed an academic route, but I thought professional services again. We should be aspiring ourselves into looking at those positions in the future. I hadn't appreciated how challenging it would be on this side. It's the structured approach to progression on the academic side has benefited colleagues, although there are still some challenges. But on the professional services side, in particular, I feel that there is a lot more we need to do in our institutions to enable progression to senior leadership positions from colleagues from ethnic minority backgrounds. Those structures are not there. The role models, the mentors, the informal networks, I think we need a lot more of that. And I find that in my daily conversations with colleagues, where we are constantly trying to battle and challenge the support system or the existing bias in the recruitment and progression activities that currently exist.
And your diversity and leadership project that I mentioned at the start of our conversation, it's part of the Higher Diversity Coalition. That's an initiative that's been brought together by the people advisory firm Gate B. Sanderson, and its purpose is to unlock those barriers that you mentioned there that persist to increasing ethnic diversity in HE leadership, particularly within student and academic services, the pathway through which you've come through. For listeners not familiar with that detailed context, can you share a bit more insight about the current picture and building on what you've said so far and even the data? What's that showing us within the sector?
Indeed. Before going on to data, I should say that Gate and B. Sanderson have been absolutely fantastic. Tessa Harrison brought all the sector bodies together, and this is the first time it's happened that we're all aligned with a single vision of improving and enhancing diversity in senior leadership positions. We recognized this need almost about 2 years ago, and we felt that we we needed to come together and identify a roadmap for us and for the rest of the sector to show the path and to establish better role models going forward. So I think we owe a debt of gratitude to them. One of the things that came out in our initial discussions were the lack of data that exists in our sector that can identify the proportion of professional services staff from ethnic minorities in senior leadership positions. So, as some colleagues would know, currently HESA requires us to submit data on both staff and students based on their ethnic minorities. Now, that staff includes academic staff only, unfortunately. The professional services staff data is not mandatory. Now, 60% of our universities do come forward and provide that data to HESA, which enables us to set some really good benchmarks, but it's 60%. One of the tasks we have going forward is ensuring that we make submission of data from universities on professional services mandatory so we can have a clearer picture of the proportion of our leadership that comes from ethnic backgrounds. Having said that, I have used some proxy data to inform some of the discussions we are having currently around this. And it transpires that a very small proportion of staff, professional services staff from ethnic backgrounds, hold these leadership positions. Now, we don't need data to tell us that. We look around the room and we can tell that's a serious issue. But if you were to look at the data, it tells you that around 81% of academic staff in our sector earn above 50,000 salary per annum. And conversely, 18% of professional services staff fall within that category. Now, that is a huge difference in the proportion or proportionality or percentages that we're looking at. That indicates there is a serious bias in our systems. It's probably unconscious bias, but there does exist a bias which prevents or inhibits staff in professional services to progress to senior positions. Now, salary is just a proxy, it's just an indication of the leadership positions. But if you look at some of the data that Advance HE has produced recently, it tells us that only 0.6% of professional services staff are leaders. And if we include directors or senior managers, that percentage goes up to just about 5%. Now, clearly, there's a lot of work for us to do in that space, but it's a start. And I think it's the data tells us a story here. It tells us where to look and how to identify these gaps.
Your specific project is called The Power of Storytelling, and you've reached out to senior leaders in professional services across the sector to nominate themselves or their colleagues from diverse ethnic backgrounds to tell their own stories in their own words. What would you say makes storytelling such a powerful medium for your project?
Storytelling is an interesting piece. Intrinsically, I've always believed in the power of storytelling because it connects people. And it's less intimidating, it's less confrontational if we are just sitting around and talking about our experiences. But what I hadn't appreciated that was that a lot of study that has been done recently that confirms this worldview I have. So back in 2020, this is not too long ago, Professor Hassan at Princeton conducted a study. His research team involved a storyteller and a listener, and they monitored the brain waves of the subjects. And they found that the more a story was told and the listener was intently listening to it, their brain waves started matching. And that was a very clear indication from the neuroscientists that it was enabling them to have a deeper understanding of what the story was about. So, developing those close links of empathy is possible through those storytelling mechanisms. And then, following on from that, there was another study done by Professor Zach at Claremont Graduate University, which also demonstrated that stories were definitely releasing oxytocin amongst the listeners, which created a feel good sensation, as we know, and developed greater levels of empathy. So for me, I think there is definitely power behind storytelling. And I felt that it was possibly one avenue through which I could reach out to colleagues in similar positions as myself to come and talk about their experiences, good, bad, ugly, whatever they were. And I did get a good mix of it. So they came forward, very few, albeit, but when they talked about their stories, they were very revealing. There were a few surprises, of course, but I think the stories themselves were hugely therapeutic with experience for those storytellers. So I think it works both ways.
And you obviously can't disclose the full details of other people's stories here, but I wonder if you could share maybe some of the themes or some excerpts from the stories coming out from your research so far.
The common themes coming out from those stories perhaps wouldn't surprise anyone, but they were around a sense of isolation that develops as you climb the professional ladder, and you're the only one of color who looks different, speaks different, and seen as the other in the room. There's a sensation of burnout because they feel that they've got to be twice as good as others to attain the level of respect and seniority in their position. There's a strong sense of self doubt that emerges from these stories. People feel an imposter syndrome, and that comes with feeling that they can't be their authentic self in a professional workplace. Now, that to me was quite stark and quite disturbing because if we don't feel safe in the workplace, we can't be ourselves, then I think there's something clearly wrong. One of the very powerful quotes I got from one of the storyteller was around role model or the lack of role models in our sector. And they said to me that if you can see it, you can be it. Now that's important, isn't it? So it worked for me. I could see someone in a senior position right in front of me, trailblazing. But for most people, that's not quite the case. And that is a very strong inhibitor for progression and belief in self that you can be attaining those heights.
And the quote you've just shared there, if you can see it, you can be it, resonated with your own experience of having a visible role model, which in turn supported your own career pathway. But as you say, many people just don't have that. Are there other notable experiences you can share that you've gathered from the story so far that illustrate the challenges?
Yes, the stories, in fact, have been quite emotive and sometimes really difficult to share and listen to. And that's the reason why I have kept them anonymous. Um, the good thing is that a lot of them felt that speaking out and talking about their stories was quite a therapeutic experience for them. So I'm pleased that I have collected these stories. I should just add a trigger warning and that it might evoke some suppressed emotions in colleagues who might be listening to some of these stories. But it's still worth sharing. I think the most important one, as I just said, is around not having enough role models in your career. It just makes it so much harder for people to navigate their career and overcome bias. So, what they told me was that they just didn't have access to those influential, informal networks, which are so important for their career advancement. For example, there was nobody who was speaking for them in the room where they were not. And that comes with a good role model or a mentor that you need by your side. Another theme that came out from their stories was being overlooked for promotion. And unfortunately, that was quite a recurring theme for many of them. They said that it was really uncomfortable being overlooked for promotions despite having excellent qualifications and good performance record. Now, how debilitating is that? Their fights and their efforts to get recognized really affected their self-esteem. I think that's really challenging for a lot of them to pursue their career goals in such an environment. I think one of them said that it was constant battle to keep demonstrating their level of competence in workplace. They had to be twice as good as their white peers, and it was constantly grinding them down, causing burnout. I think the most corrosive of all they felt was some of the verbal and non-verbal microaggressions. One of them talked about how they were constantly faced with colleagues who were either unable to remember their name or kept pronouncing their name wrong. There was one who said that they were constantly getting confused with someone else from a similar ethnicity or color. I guess once or twice is fine, but when it happens far too often, it becomes quite corrosive. A lot of them felt that they were always invited to an EDI meeting, despite that not being their area of expertise. And sometimes carrying that burden or constantly was not what they had signed up for. Another interesting thing I found in one of the stories was the non-verbal microaggressions they faced. The eye rolling and people turning away when they were still talking in a meeting. Collectively, they felt that it felt like a death from thousand cuts. This made me feel that we had to really talk about these, however uncomfortable these truths are. But they are people's truths, they are their lived experiences in this day and age, and we have to challenge them where they're happening. Another one I'll mention, because that's quite close to my heart as well, is a sense of being invisible in a workplace. Now, I laugh it off most of the times and I call it my superpower, but the reality is when you're in a meeting and you're making a point, it gets ignored. And when someone else, of a different color, I suppose, says the same point in a slightly different way, they get all the attention. Now, that is quite difficult to deal with in most circumstances. And it really affects your self-confidence and your self-esteem. One of the storytellers really brought it home to me when she said that these repeated if impact of microaggression has resulted in depression, headaches, high blood pressure, and sleep difficulties. How awful is that? It shouldn't happen. It really shouldn't happen. I think it's really important we support our colleagues and continue on this journey to move away from this environment and make our workplace more inclusive and welcoming for everyone.
The stories you've just shared there are hugely powerful, and thank you for sharing them on the podcast. There will be colleagues listening to this who sadly will have similar lived experiences. There'll be other listeners who'll have varying levels of awareness of these experiences happening to some colleagues from diverse ethnic backgrounds. Hearing those stories and knowing there are other stories out there, it's uncomfortable and it's actually unacceptable in our sector. Actions clearly needed, sector actions clearly needed. What would you say needs to happen to enable the Power of Storytelling project to move to its next phase?
I think the first thing is recognition of the fact that there is a serious gap that needs to be filled. Data suggests the gap. The stories are showing the gap. And no matter how much we think we are inclusive and our culture is improving, it's not necessarily enabling colleagues from ethnic backgrounds to feel comfortable and confident to apply for senior positions. So that recognition is really important. The second thing is strong leadership, aligning leadership vision of an institution with having diverse communities and enabling those diverse communities to flourish and succeed is absolutely critical. There is, I think, as a sector, we need to perhaps recognize that we are a reflection of our society. Our student body is changing, it's getting more diverse. Our academic community is evolving as well. Professional services are being left behind, unfortunately. The number of staff in junior positions who come from ethnic backgrounds is increasing. There is data to suggest that. But they seem to be staying in those junior positions, and that pipeline of growth and development is not working. So I think it's clarity of vision of where we want to be as an institution and have a holistic approach to supporting both staff and students to reach their potential and have all the barriers removed is absolutely critical. What I would really like to see is a policy debate at a national level where we recognize this as a challenge and we embrace that challenge and we do something about it.
And I guess your point there about the national level is a really important one, because there can be specific initiatives within a specific institution. But that's not going to address, is it, the overall pipeline of professional services colleagues who will move around the sector. That might be regionally, it might be nationally, but it is about that career path all the way across the sector, not just in one institution.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I'm really keen is to learn from the private sector. We tend to be quite insular in higher education, where we look within ourselves and try to find solutions and repeat the same solutions, thinking we'll find answers to those challenging questions from repeating them. But that doesn't always work. There are instances that we find where some of the initiatives in the private sector have resulted in a really good outcome, and we could potentially learn from them. So I'm really keen to open ourselves to influences from across the sectors, but also across national boundaries. Perhaps look outside. Maybe there are examples of good practice in other countries.
I imagine that a lot of people listening to this and people who you're talking to outside this podcast in other settings and in other national settings and in institutions as well, they'd no doubt agree with the steps that you've set out there about what needs to happen next. But I guess we also need to recognise that we're working in a sector that's going through a pretty tough time at the moment, and where prioritisation is probably taking place more than we've ever seen it before in relation to focus and resource. In that context, how much concern do you have that addressing diversity systemically could take a temporary back seat? Or do you think there is sufficient progress and sufficient groundwork not to lose the momentum?
You're absolutely right. I think in a current financial climate, the first casualty will be downgrading some of the other priorities, and diversity, unfortunately, tends to fall within that category. We have to make our institutions sustainable first, and students come first. So you cannot disagree with that. But my argument here is that diverse leadership tends to result in excellent decision making. And there is evidence to suggest that. I think we need to recognize the fact that improving diversity within our institutions is not just a priority, it's an essential. So it should not be competing with other priorities as such, but it should be a way of life. It should be part of our culture. It should be part of our thinking. And that's where we need to get to. It's a mind shift. And the work that we're doing, whether it's through stories or data gathering or policy debate, I'm very confident will get us there, where we will recognize that this is who we are. We are a reflection of the society, and this is how we need to operate going forward. So I think we will get there, but you're right. Current financial climate doesn't make it any easier for us to do that.
And you mentioned earlier about the increase in the student body diversity in many of our institutions. And I'm wondering whether the students could be advocates at all in terms of addressing diversity within the staff body. We talked about role models, what they see, how that works, some of the challenges students have. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, indeed. I think the students already do. They ask, especially those who are dealing with mental health issues in particular, or they require support with cases of sexual violence and harassment, for example. They give us a very clear steer that they would like to only speak to staff who look like them, who would understand their cultural background and the challenges they are facing, both emotionally and physically, which requires us as an institution, it's our obligation to ensure that we make it more comfortable for them to speak to someone they can see their reflection in. So that, I think that already exists, but it's never essentially been presented in a way where we can have a national debate around it. It is gathering momentum gradually, in some institutions more than others, but I think it will it will pick up. I'm very confident that our student community will start asking for more very soon.
You're the fourth academic registrar to be on the podcast, each of you talking about different topics. And I know from all of you that the role is hugely demanding, particularly in these times. And yet, alongside the demanding day job, you are progressing the Power of Storytelling project because of its importance that we've talked about today. What's your ultimate goal as you move to the next phase of your own career? And is there a moment where you can say, yes, I've done what I set out to do, or will the story just move to the next chapter?
The story needs to move to the next chapter indeed, but I think my vision for future is that I would like to see people of colour occupying senior leadership positions in almost all institutions, or at least having prospects open to them. And the only way I can measure that success would be to have a network of people. If I set about creating a network now, I will probably only have a handful of people joining it. That's the unfortunate truth of it all. So I would like to see that network grow, and I would like to also be in a position where we speak with a single voice and it's heard.
We'll put some links to you and to the wider Higher Diversity Coalition work on the podcast website. But wrapping up our conversation today, would you like to say a final few words about why you'd like people to be part of your Power of Storytelling project?
Absolutely. Collecting stories has not been easy. As you can imagine, people have found it very difficult to talk about their experiences. And as such, they've felt reluctant to come forward. A few have on the condition of anonymity, but there have been a few brave ones who have put their name to their stories, for which I'm really grateful. What I would like to see is people connect with me and tell their stories and believe that it will genuinely change our institutions for the future and for the better.
Monika, thank you so much for being my guest today. It's been great spending some time with you.
Thank you.
Job Shadowing HE was written and presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more information about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.